Good morning, everyone. And I know that our students have become, very, very eager to be here in a classroom after 1 week of not doing anything, right, because of the flooding. So we are very happy to have with us both, in these very difficult circumstances, to have both Dr. Ranga Narayan, who is the son of the T.G. Narayanan. We have today the T.G. Narayanan Memorial Lecture, and we have a very distinguished speaker, Dr. Usha Ramanathan, who we had invited last year, and unfortunately it didn't work out. So we're very pleased that even in these difficult circumstances, we are all here to listen to what she has to say on a topic, a vocabulary to be dismantled, poverty, prejudice, and the harshness of inverted euphemisms. It's a long title, but I think it's bound to be very interesting given the age in which we live. So let me first invite Dr. Ranga Narayanan to say a few words about his father, T.G. Narayanan.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to see students in this audience. Just a few words. These lecture series bear the name of T.G. Narayanan because of his because of the abiding interest that he had in deprivation. He was born on June the 9th, 1911. And had his education at the Madras Christian College for intermediate, and later got an honors in English at the Madras Presidency College. And after teaching in Alway for a short time, he then joined the Hindu, so where he was first a journalist, wrote during the war about the war effort in Imphal, wrote about the freedom movement in Indonesia, and then was posted, and then also dealt with deprivation through the famine in Bengal, a famine that took several million lives, at least 2.5 million lives, as best as we can tell. He then wrote a book on it called Famine Over Bengal. Now, towards the last of his years in the Hindu, he was posted in New Delhi, where he interviewed several freedom fighters. Soon after independence, he joined the United Nations at the behest of Pandit Nehru, not as an Indian diplomat, but as an Indian working in the United Nations as a diplomat, but not representing India. So he joined the Asiatic division, and then in time he began to cover nuclear disarmament affairs and spent his last years in Geneva as the representative of the then Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld. Now, because of the interest that he's had, as I said, in deprivation, we decided to have these lecture series. Over the years, some of you might have observed that we have had economists, social scientists, journalists who have been interested in deprivation, and last year we actually had a scientist to talk about public health. This year we are fortunate and blessed to have with us a scholar who has worked for many years in the area of human rights and also environmental law, I understand. So I look forward to hearing her, and thank you very much for being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ranga Narayan. So I'm going to just very briefly introduce to you the speaker for today, Dr. Usha Ramanathan. So Dr. Usha Ramanathan works on the jurisprudence of law, poverty, and rights. She researches, writes, and speaks on issues that include the nature of law, the Bhopal gas disaster, mass displacement, eminent domain, manual scavenging, civil liberties including the death penalty, beggary, criminal law, custodian institutions, the environment, judicial process. She has been tracking and engaging with the Indian National ID Project. In fact, she's lectured on Aadhaar, quite a few, the Aadhaar card, which is mandatory today in quite a few places. And she has written and debated extensively on the subject. She has been writing and debating issues of technology and the human conditions of freedom and liberty over the years. She is currently at work on a philosophy for technology. So let me invite Dr. Usha Ramanathan to deliver her lecture.
Thank you very much both to ACJ and Dr. Ranga for calling me to speak here. Actually, I'm particularly grateful because I don't think I would have met your father, T.G. Narayanan, if not for this. Because when you said that this was to be a T.G. Narayanan memorial lecture, I said I can't speak in the memory of someone who I have no introduction to. And then I looked at his year of birth and I said, well, it's okay that I didn't meet him, but I should know something about him before I speak. And actually, he's a fascinating person, and I think every person in journalism and beyond needs to see what he represents. So even as I begin, I'm going to make this request to ACJ and to Dr. Ranga that I think when you hear what he's been involved in, it is important to write a biography of his work. And as journalists, you're going to find it really fascinating to see what kind of an indelible mark you can leave, and which kind of carries on through generations. And this, so when I read this, an article on him, I found. When I read an article on him, I found that first of all, like you've been told, he's been involved. He was covering between 1938 and 1946. He was covering a range, all that happened in that time which was of significance to us, virtually everything that was of significance to us. He covered the war, he covered the freedom movement, the nationalist movement, he covered the famine, and he covered the INA. And what was really interesting was the authors of the article speak of how he amplified Gandhiji's voice, but he didn't agree with him about everything. And one of the things that he had a difference of opinion on was the INA. Because Gandhi's opinion of the INA is quite well known, and it's also fascinating that, never mind what their opinion, when the INA went on trial, when 3 members of the INA went on trial, you should read the transcript of that trial, because it is learning to think about what patriotism is and what a cause is, and how people may fight for a cause and have ethics on their side, even if they did things that might have been illegal at the time that it happened. And that's going to be one of the themes of today. So, this idea of illegality. So that was fascinating. But, like Dr. Ranga told us, he didn't stop there. And I think one of the most important things that happened after the Second World War was what happened to the idea of the nuclear that had come in. And for someone to be involved in those negotiations between the US and USSR on nuclear disarmament, what he must have done when he was there, the kind of work he would have put into this is fascinating. So my request really is that there are multiple places where you might find sources for, where you might be able to source his work. And if that could be brought together, it will tell us something about the nature of the world in that time. We are back again in the world, in a world where war seems to be getting normalized. And we need to get past it. We need to understand what went wrong in that, in that period when the war, the war was being fought, and what happened because of the war. The whole nuclear struggle that we have in our hands today is because we had the Second World War. It's possible too, of course, that scientists might anyway have come up with it, but it might not have been. And this is, of course, it's hypothetical, like many other things. When we look back on history and we are talking about what might have been, it is hypothetical. But it is possible that perhaps that it would not have been used as a weapon of war, but might have had other purposes if it was ever found, which parenthetically I may say I wish it never had. I mean, it's like AI today. We have, all kinds of threats that are in our midst today, which we have to deal with. So, with that request, I move on. But the second thing that I have to say is I have to apologize for the title of this talk. Just forget it exists. I mean, I had no business putting the second part of the title to this talk. It's just that when I put the first part, it didn't say what I will be speaking about. And so I thought about what could be said. I think my head was in a complex phase and it couldn't think simply. When I say inverted euphemism, I'll just tell you what that means so that you know that I wasn't just using words, I actually meant something. So euphemism, at least as I understand it, is something that softens the harshness of what is being said. So you don't say it harshly, you soften it, you produce gentleness in language, which makes it a little easier to take an idea in. An inverted euphemism is the opposite. Something that should be gentle acquires harshness when you invert it. And when we think about many contexts of poverty, impoverishment, when you think about many of those contexts, they are all inverted euphemisms. They are words that that may not in themselves hold harshness, but the meaning is incredibly harsh. And the words themselves actually are also very harsh. So the idea was to say that where we need to be kind, we are terrible. And so that's the beginning of what I'm going to say. It's also to say that the talks are on destitution and social deprivation. What I intend to speak to you about, when I realized you're all students of journalism, I was thinking about the kind of influence you have and you will have as you go into your profession in routinizing the meanings of words. So it's primarily going to be to tell you what I have seen over these years on the routinizing of this meaning, of various meanings that have been given to words, and how you may need to help us break that meaning apart and dismantle the vocabulary that has developed. That part of it I hold it in the sense that we do need to dismantle many vocabularies that have come in. As a lawyer, I find that legality and illegality, legitimacy and illegitimacy are contexts which we are constantly battling with, because what seems legitimate to some is something that should be done away with for others. So we'll deal with some of those situations. I'm just going to tell you a few stories of, and these are stories that have developed through, when newspapers report them, and we get to hear these stories, and then we keep developing them in our heads, and then we go to the field and we see it. It helps us understand what has been reported. So I'm just going to tell you a few of those. But before I begin, I should say this, that before I go to the stories, I should say this, that there are some axioms that have developed, over these years. And I'll just tell you one or two of them. One of them is this, that poverty does not come by invitation. Poverty visits people. People find themselves poor or in conditions of poverty. Poor sounds like a static term, but poverty is not static. It has a way of ebbing. Very often it has a way of deepening if it's unable to pull itself out of it. So the fundamental thing to remember then is that poverty does not come by invitation. The second axiom that as a lawyer I found really significant, when I look at all the laws that have been made, what is being done in the contexts of people who are going to be affected by the law and who will not be able to meet the demands of the law. And that's the second axiom, which is legality is unattainable without resources. So someone who doesn't have resources will find it very difficult to be legal. And that's the nature of law, and that is the nature of poverty. The third is that there is something deeply flawed about a system that produces generations in poverty. See, we have welfare systems that are brought in, we have various kinds of things that are being introduced to try and alleviate poverty. There are, for instance, now it's the DBT. It's become an acronym that I think nobody has any doubt what it means. Direct benefit transfer. So it's a benefit. So a benefit should be benefiting the person beyond keeping them where they are forever and ever. So if there are multiple generations who continue in poverty, then there is something that is deeply flawed about this system. So the way we approach that system we may need to train ourselves to look at it to know that there is something wrong with the system that continuously keeps people in poverty and very often in a deepening of that poverty. We've had many years, say from about the 60s, late 60s to about the beginning of the 2000s, when we saw some kind of an improvement in the lives of people. And then we find that if you were here in the 50s and 60s, which most of you were not, I see that there are some senior persons here who were there, the way you recognized poverty was very different from how you recognized it, say, in the 70s or 80s. In the 60s, when I was a student, and we would go out to the, we had to do a lot, we could either do NCC or we did our community service. And I was a student of sociology, so many of us went to multiple places to do work, completely uncomprehending of what we were seeing, but being exposed to it nevertheless. And we found that one of the ways that you could see a person was definitely poor and very poor was when their stomach would touch their spine. That's the direness of conditions then, and that began to improve, and it was very reassuring watching the change happen. In the 80s, for instance, the number of cases of starvation deaths had began to come down dramatically. It was still there in some parts of India, but it was beginning to come down. It was beginning to be noticed. It was beginning to be written about, which makes a huge difference to our awareness of what it is that we are doing to the world around us. But so by about the 2000s, early 2000s, it seemed like we could be pulling ourselves out of that kind of deep poverty. I think we need to go back and explore why it seems like we've begun to slide back. Why is it that we've heard of starvation deaths again at times when we should never be hearing about it? So the idea, and which is why I said there are some generations, intermediate generations, which seemed like they were getting themselves pulled out of poverty, but then you find that there is a slipping back that's happening. It needs a lot of interrogation. We really need to care, otherwise it's not going to happen. And this, of course, is particularly in the context of manual scavenging, where sewer line deaths keep happening. And it's, we seem to be in a place where the only answer to this, to mitigate that we know, is to give people compensation when they die. And you have people who are from the community who will turn around and say, in the first instance, when you said compensation, that was fine because people were already dead. You were giving us compensation, that's fine. But actually, we are not coming to you to see if we can get more money when we die. You're saying we don't want to die. Why do we have to be killed and then paid money, right? So the axiom that's developed around that is this, that work that kills is not work at all. I think that we should get it into our heads. We can't say, okay, you go and work, when you die, we will do whatever. It can't be work if it is work that kills. So work that kills is not work at all, but a sentence of perpetual risk and probable death. It is that dire. It can't be softened. It has to be said the way it is, and it is that dire. With this as some kind of a background, I'll just go back over what has happened in the past about 40 years, which is the time, 40, 50 years, which is the time I've watched all of this evolve while even as I watched, things began to change and many things have happened. Many things happened because people cared. People worked on various kinds of communities and community issues that kept arising. So these are just stories about what happened in different contexts. And I'll just start with this, that when I say dismantle a vocabulary, what do I mean? So for years and years, we've had a police act, and we've had mental health law which came in somewhere along the way. We had in the early 1900s a law called the Lunacy Act. And under the Lunacy Act, see, when you have an act that recognizes, or when you have a legislation or a policy that recognizes that some people have certain traits which make them, which singles them out. So you have to treat them recognizing what the problem is. In the context of lunacy, you could have one of two ways in which you dealt with it. You could either say, I care about people who have mental illness, and therefore I need to reach out and do what I can to make their lives better. Or, and unfortunately very often it is an or, it doesn't have to be an either or, but very often it is an or, where we say a person has lunacy, so we need to protect the rest of society from them. And it is a second that dominated for the longest time. Part of the reason is because in the early 1900s, people didn't know what to do with people who had mental illness. People who were lunatics, you had to custodialize them, you had to put them away because they could be dangerous to others. Science developed, but I don't think our thinking about it developed sufficiently. So we had the Indian Lunacy Act for a very long time. In the meantime, the Mental Health Act came in, and therefore the mental health became the priority and lunacy kind of took a backseat. But did it really vanish? Why? How did that language linger? So we have the idea of non-criminal mentally ill people. They used to be called lunatics. They were not called non-criminal mentally ill people. They were called lunatics. They were people who would be found wandering, in the streets, and any person passing by could tell a policeman, or any social worker could pick them up and put them into institutions. So the idea of custodializing, institutionalizing people meant that any problem that we had, anything that was out of something that we were ready to deal with, would get institutionalized. So the answer to it was always put them away. And if you look at any of these institutions, including children's homes, the significant thing that you'll see when you go there is high walls. So what happens behind those walls, none of us knows. And entry into those walls used to be virtually impossible. So even now, when you want to visit a prisoner, you know how much you have to go through before you can even visit a prisoner, because you need access to them. So just entering it was not so easy. And they were all consigned to institutions. That is the language that was used. You consigned them to the institution. In the late 1980s, when public interest litigation had meant that some of these institutions began to open up. The late 1970s, it was actually a newspaper report that triggered off the first major case in PIL. And that was a case where they found that very large numbers of people, at one count it was 18,133 people, were in the prisons, different prisons of Bihar. And this is, when I say Bihar, sometimes people say, that's why. And actually it's not true. It's just that reporter had reported from Bihar. It was happening across the country, where people were in prison, had been in prison for periods that were longer than the time they may have had to be in prison if they had been convicted, without bail. Why? Because they'd been put away and forgotten. And if you don't know how to reach, if you don't have someone who can get you a lawyer, if you don't have wherewithal outside, and if they don't care enough to get you out, you could be in prison for very long periods of time and forgotten. The idea of forgetting people once they are behind walls is a very, very major part of the jurisprudence that we have in this country. And we'll find, we were just talking about this a minute ago, about children's homes and what happened in Bihar. The Muzaffarpur thing, which some of you might want to go and read up about, because it's a horror story that once there are walls that are built, nothing seems to be able to penetrate them, and those who are inside don't seem to find that they are able to get out. So as part of a PIL that was going on in this matter, there were a range of things that happened. But one of the things that happened was, it was found that among these prisoners, and among people who were in different kinds of what are called homes, there were people who were there as wandering lunatics. See, this is the language that was being used. They were wandering, And in this context, because of the way our law has developed and the idea of public order has developed, anybody wandering is treated as dangerous. There is a dangerousness attributed to people who are wandering. And then on top of that, if you're a lunatic, then it's like, there is actually no recourse at all. The law said that any wandering lunatic who is found should be sent to a place of safe custody. How many places of safe custody do we have which can hold persons with mental illness? So it was found that many of them ended up in prisons. They would be in a separate wing. Prisons don't have, now they are struggling to find psychiatrists who can provide services within prisons. They didn't exist then. And they would just be there. So it's like once you are in for this, you're in, that's it. You're forgotten after that. Now what made it even, what really brought this whole thing into the public eye was was finding that because you have this provision which says wandering lunatics can be picked up and put away into institutions, they found that there were people, for instance, there was a woman who was staying in a house. She was an oldish woman, and the landlord wanted it back, and she had the right to stay on there. He found it too difficult to negotiate with her. It was easier to negotiate with the local police, who went, picked her up, said she was a wandering lunatic, put her into prison, and that was it. So when commissioners were appointed by the commissioners went to these various prisons and found that there were many people who were really mentally unsound. They needed help. And so taking them out of the prison was the first thing, but also finding that the law can be abused in 100 different ways. All it needed was the tag of being a wandering lunatic. And that's, that kind of took care of the rest. So the first thing, therefore, the court had to do was to change the language in which you thought about people. And they said there is no such thing as lunacy. There are people they are non-criminal, first of all. You don't treat them as criminals. And they are mentally ill, which means they need treatment. If you're not well, what you need is to be taken towards wellness. So this was the first time that we noticed that the significance of language and how you deal with it. It's not the first time, but it was one of the early times when the importance of language came in. Why I'm saying this to you also is because when you start reporting, very often my sympathy goes to the reporters who have to file their stories really quickly. They don't have the time to think about what language they are putting in. So whatever is given to them, they put it in. You end up perpetuating various kinds of prejudices, which then become normalized. And it's that normalizing, it's that routinizing of language like this that we need to try and break, if we have to break some of these habits of thought. I'll just leave that there and give you a few other illustrations of what happened. For the longest time after independence, when the whole project of development started, it was important for the state to be able to get land, because land is needed for virtually every project of development. And we've had a Land Acquisition Act from 1894, and one of the strange things is that these are laws that survived for the longest time. It went on till 2013. So you had a law that was made by a colonial power which was trying to get as much as land as it could for its development project, and we continued with it after the Constitution, and strangely enough it was never struck down as being unconstitutional. So it had its life. And the practices that existed prior to independence continued after independence. But there was a certain kind of logic that was given to the continuation of this practice, which was that and it's not an unfair logic, which is that India needed to become self-sustaining. India needed to show that it could, it could survive without a colonial power. In fact, why we needed to prove that, I don't know, but we did. And so you needed, therefore, many of the things that had been there earlier. And in the Constitution, we have two very interesting things. We have, on the law, it says that in the fundamental rights chapter, it says that any law that is made that is violative of fundamental rights is null and void. So it has no validity. But much later in the Constitution, in Article 372, you have a provision that says all laws in force in India will continue to be in force till it is either repealed or struck down. So this would be, the exception carved out would be for fundamental rights. The question was to understand whether forcible acquisition of land for whatever development project it might be is a violation of a fundamental right or not. And I don't think that question ever got answered well, and partly because of the way we use language. And that's it. That's one of the, law depends a lot on language. So if we change the language, it will change the nature of law. In this case, we have a doctrine called the doctrine of eminent domain. Many people presume many things that it means. The basic meaning given to it is when you say eminent domain, it is the power of a state to take private land for a public purpose. Actually, eminent domain would not apply unless it's private land. So what happens to all those which are public lands? And the idea of the public for many years was the public, people. When you said republic, you meant people. That we find has changed over time. Today, when you have public-private partnerships, public is the government, not the people. So, but in that journey that we made between having the public as the people in the beginning and public today, as we have the government becoming the public, where people tend to disappear. There are only two turfs. There is the private and the government, and there are no other turfs. The people are no longer a turf. In the beginning, when there were many people, if you read, there is a very interesting book written by Shripad. Manthan is their organization, and it's on Bakra Dam. And many years after the Bakra Dam had been built, they went to meet the people who had been displaced by the dam. And when they asked them, many of them, their lives stopped. When they were shifted out of where they were for the construction of the dam, their lives didn't move on. So when he went to interview them and to ask them, they said, no, we were very happy to give our land because we thought development was important for us and we thought we would be part of that development. But we got left behind. So the idea of sacrificing is a common thing that was used in the first 30, 40 years of development, say till about the 80s, where people had to sacrifice something so that there could be, the larger public good would be served. The problem is, and that's the time that this term of marginalization also came. So you find till the third five-year plan, nobody recognized, the state didn't recognize that people were getting marginalized in the processes of development. We find now, in the early 90s, we found that about 60% of the people who had been displaced for projects were tribal people belonging to tribal communities. They constitute 8 to 10% of the population. But in displacement, it is about 60%. Just think about what it means if you belong to that community and what it tells you about your ability to survive. And how did this happen? How did the state think it had this power? Because we gave it that power. We said, you have the power of eminent domain, which is to take land and to use it for a public purpose, but please use it kindly. We didn't challenge the power of the state to be able to take this kind of land away. The importance of breaking down the idea of eminent domain only reached our consciousness somewhere in the early 1990s, by which time many habits and practices of state policy had already set in. That's another time that we recognize the importance of language. In that context, for all development projects, they would say there is land acquisition happening. Land acquisition happens for projects, it's true, but many people who don't have any land also get impacted by projects. You think about, the whole Narmada Sardar Sarovar project. What that movement did for us to understand what the law is, what language is, what people are, what happens to people. One of the things we realized at that time, over a period of time, but based on our experience there, is that after the Second World War, which is also why I'm very interested in what happened in that period, after the Second World War, virtually all of the world got divided up into countries. And you take our country, we can make Parliament makes law. And whatever law Parliament makes applies to everybody in the territory of India. Whether the lawmakers know of the existence of people or not, the law applies to them. So there might be people who are living among the mountains who haven't really been met. There might be people, like there were in the Sardar Sarovar project, we found that there were people who had never encountered the state before then. The state didn't know they existed, and they didn't know the state existed, but the law applied to them. So it's a really, it's a very weird kind of situation. I mean, I've started thinking about the law very differently after seeing this context. That the law can be made for people you don't even know exist. Forget about don't even know. It applies to everybody. So in that, we found that this idea of acquisition meant that the state we were giving, by accepting eminent domain, we were giving the state the power to take whatever land it wanted in its project of development. The major change that happened in language, which completely shifted our thinking on this, was when we stopped talking about acquisition and started talking about mass displacement. Huge numbers of people. If you look at the Narmada Dam, 243 villages were already expected to be submerged in the project. This is not 1 or 2 people, this is not 60 or 70 people who can be accommodated here or there or wherever else. These are whole communities going under. This meant, and there are many projects across where you'll find that this is happening. So the idea of mass displacement changed the nature of the discourse. It hasn't been adopted sufficiently by the press, but it has become part of academic literature. Nobody talks really as much about acquisition in the context of these development projects as we talk about mass displacement. So I could just multiply these for you, and I am in fact going to tell you 1 or 2 more. One of those is, the important thing to know about this is also that every time a change has happened, it's happened because of people's movements. It's happened because the way in which you recognize something, you need time to spend time with it to recognize that something has changed, that it is not what you thought it was. This is not acquisition, this is mass displacement. You need to change the way you think about it. So one of the things that affects the urban is the context of beggary. So the idea of beggary has been it's an amazing legislation that we have. As a lawyer, for me, I think that's among the most unconstitutional laws that we have, but it continues to exist in many states. I think it's important also to tell you that there are at least 2 states, Jammu and Kashmir and Delhi, where most parts of this law have been struck down as being unconstitutional, but it continues everywhere else. And people continue to use it. So just to give you one illustration of what happened before the law was struck down in Delhi, the anti-beggary law, it's called the Prevention of Begging Act. So it's not, in the 1950s, when there was still, I think, some kindness in public policy that existed, there were people who worked around what needed to be done, because there are so many people who are found begging on the streets. Something needs to be done with them. So they said, we need to bring them in, take them to an institution, and give them some skill, and then let them go. So there were therefore different phases in this. First, you have to be able to recognize who are the people who are begging on the streets. Then you have to bring them into the institution. Then you have to train them, and then you let them go so that they can go back with a skill and they can earn for themselves. Now, the critical part in this was imparting a skill. In imparting a skill that will get them some kind of employment when they get out. Unfortunately, as happens in very many legislations, the power of the state gets used, but the responsibility of the state may not get met. So you'll find that in many places, almost every state, there will be what are called raids and roundups. Now this is the other thing where we completely need to throw this language out. It's not just dismantling it, we need it thrown out, because the idea that people who are found, and I'll just read out for you the definition of begging under the law. It says, begging means having no visible means of subsistence. This is about poverty. And wandering about or remaining in any public place in such condition or manner as makes it likely that the person doing so exists soliciting or receiving alms. This is just ostensible poverty. If you are poor and you are in a public space, then you are vulnerable to being treated as a person who is in beggary. And like a court asked in 2007, so if I want to work for the welfare of persons in beggary, and I go around with, collecting donations, and I get permission to receive money or funds from wherever, there is no punishment for me. Nothing will be done with me. But if I am hungry, and I go and ask somebody, can you please give me something, then I will be punished under this law. So the complete absurdity of this. So for many years, and the Delhi instance is so, it's so illustrative of what happens around the country. There was unfortunately in that case, it was a lawyer who was standing, she says she was standing in her car, the car was standing at a signal, and she just has this much to say that a beggar in a blue lungi came to me and asked me for alms. When I did not give, he threatened me that he will touch me because he had leprosy. He was and that I will also get leprosy. So she took this to the court and said, why is it that the state is not implementing this law? And it became a major case, during which 8 people died in the beggar's home. So they said, 8 people died, what happened? So they sent in somebody to investigate, and he found that the water line and the sewer line had got mixed up. That's as much as we care. I mean, it's also because we need to break through our own prejudices. We often say, don't have prejudice. I think that's not fair. I think all of us have prejudices. But in certain work, we have to get past our prejudices. We can't allow our prejudices to become our judgment, and that would be really tragic. Now, it's a punishment, it's a punishable offense inside a beggar's home for you not to eat the food that is given to you. And that was done in many of these, all institutions have this rule. And that's done so that you don't go on hunger strike. They don't want people who are going to be sitting there and giving trouble to the administration. So if you refuse food, you can be punished for it. It's a punishable offense within the institution. And you have, in this case, when they refused the food saying it's not good, they were forced to eat it and they died. 8 of them died. Now there are all these contexts that keep developing. Another person went in at the same time to report from another beggar's home and said that there was a complaint that was made saying dogs are being set on people who are taken in as beggars in the first instance. So they outlawed the dogs. But they said everybody gets beaten up when they go in so that they will submit to what is happening within the prison since they don't have any discipline. Now these are words. I think the word discipline, for instance, should actually vanish from the dictionary. It's not just from these contexts. Disciplining is about unequal power. And there are a whole host of contexts for that which I won't go into. But when you look at what happened in the case of the case of beggary, it's that it was found that many people would get picked up in raids and roundups. So it's like a quota to fulfill. If you don't have enough people in the beggar's home will get out of the hands of the social welfare department. So you have to have enough people there. Very often you'll find that in the Bangalore beggars home, for instance, when 248 people died over a short period, and they were asked, they said, well, when they were brought in, they were already so sick. Then the question is, why were they here and not in a hospital? Why do you wait for them to die? So there is a context that has developed of dispensability of some people, and I think we need to be able to break through this too. It's going to be a task. It's going to be a task addressing the prejudices of whole publics who are going to be reading you. But this idea of dispensability, that some people are dispensable, that you can only pay so much attention to them, it's something that we might have to learn to get over our own prejudices to address. But the thing I think we see everywhere, all around us, and I think if everyone would have either read it or met it somewhere, seen something of it, is slum demolition. The moment you say slum, it evokes a certain image, a certain imagination. We think of it as being dirty, we think of it as being unhygienic, without any sewage or whatever. So, and poor people who are dirty. So this is the kind of imagination that for many people it evokes. And that's a terrible way to start thinking about people. In that context, we found that, the slum demolition is asked because they say these are all people who are encroachers. So I just want to tell you one episode where, and then I'll tell you a little bit more, but I'll tell you this one episode first, which is that there was a case that was going on in the Supreme Court, and it was on solid waste disposal. Because many cities have this problem of solid waste disposal. In Delhi, you have two agencies. You have what is called the Delhi Development Authority, like you have here. I mean, every city has its development authorities. That's called the DDA. And then you have the Municipal Corporation of Delhi. Under a law that was made in 1957, they had set up this DDA, and the DDA was given the authority to acquire land, from in Delhi, and then redistribute it, reallocate it for different purposes. So it might be for a hospital, for a school, for a university, whatever, for courts. So you find that, the DDA then acquired a lot of land, and they had to redistribute that land. The Municipal Corporation of Delhi is responsible for solid waste disposal. The case is before the court. The case of slums is not before the court. But for some reason, the judges are very annoyed that there are so many slums around. And there is a paragraph in the judgment where they lash out at agencies which are not able to prevent the proliferation of slums. They say instead of getting rid of slums, instead of slum clearance, you seem to be a slum creation department, and they are going hammer and tongs at the institutions of state. In that process, they also say, and this you may or may not have heard of, but anyone who was around and thinking in around 2001 would have heard about this. They say that giving resettlement to a slum dweller is like rewarding a pickpocket. So a direct connection being made between slum dwelling and criminality. So as it is, we have the language of illegality and of encroachers. I think this is another word that we really need to use I don't know where we can use it, except, for wanton encroachment somewhere. This is something you can't use in the context of poverty at all. People do not encroach. People stay somewhere because everyone needs some physical space in which to stay. So the idea, the moment you say encroacher, it means that you are illegal, it means you don't have a right to be there, and that you need to be taken out of that place. So here you have this likening with criminality. In the 1957 Act, where the DDA was allowed to acquire land, they had acquired all that land. Now MCD comes to court in the same case, it's in the same judgment. You just look at what it means and what task you have ahead of you. In that same judgment, you have the court, after saying all this about slum dwellers, likening them to pickpockets, they say the question now is of solid waste disposal. And the Municipal Corporation of Delhi is not giving land, the DDA is not giving land to the Municipal Corporation of Delhi to dispose of it. They need landfill sites. And DDA is telling MCD, pay for the land and take it. And the court says, now this is a public interest issue. This is for everybody's good. So the DDA should give land for free for solid waste disposal to the MCD. The starkness of this, where people who are living in slums are not seen as a public responsibility at all, and solid waste disposal is, and therefore you shouldn't ask them to pay for solid waste disposal, is striking in this. The tragedy is that because in reporting we only pick up whatever makes headlines, the solid waste disposal part of it just got lost. Fortunately, there wasn't much sympathy with the court on likening slum dwellers with pickpockets. But there is another dimension to this too. The DDA was allowed to acquire land under a legislation. They had to then, in Delhi for instance, 27% of the land which they had was to be for economically weaker section housing. It's 2005. there are reports that are being sent to the Planning Commission before they make their final report. And in one of those reports, they say that 90% of the housing stock that has not been created by the state, which they were duty bound to do under legislation, 90% of that is economically weaker section housing. Now, who did wrong? Who did right? How do we learn to look at this? So, all I'm asking is that I know you can't be spending your time looking at the nuances of all of this. It is difficult. But it develops over a period of time. So, how you watch it? How do you treat language? How do you treat the language of illegality? It really makes a difference to how people will be able to live their lives after that. In the case of, in the case of the beggary, why did the two courts finally, Jammu and Kashmir and Delhi, why did they say that this had to be struck down? Because work had been done before. And there were 4 things that, that were placed as principles. One is that you cannot criminalize poverty. It makes no sense to criminalize poverty. The second is no custodialization. We are talking about people. We are talking very often about adults. Adults may not have control over their own, because they don't have resources, they may not have control over being legal. But they are adults and you need to take them into confidence and help them get past where they are, which is why the axioms in the beginning. The third thing is don't bring in the judiciary. The moment you bring in the judiciary, there are restraints that are placed in all kinds of ways, which means that freedoms get affected immediately. And the fourth is don't bring in the police. Because this is a social welfare function. Why would you bring the police into this? What can they contribute to it? So with all of this, with these 4 basic principles, if you were to look at what should be done with persons who are, who are in begging. And this is the other thing to remember, persons who do begging, don't do begging through the year. Many of them are people who seasonally, when they have work, they will work. When there is no work to survive, they ask for what it is that they want. So this idea that poverty can be criminalized, I think it's something that has to be centrally addressed and completely broken down. There is no point in criminalizing poverty. If I tell you that in the Beggars Act they have a provision which says that once you're picked up, if you're able to give an undertaking that within 1 month you will be gainfully employed, they will let you off. Now, how am I going to guarantee that I can be gainfully employed? I haven't been able to be gainfully employed. And now you're talking like my not having a job is only my problem, that I created the problem. So in contexts of this kind, and I also thought, I was very happy to come this year. I wish I could have come last year. But I'm happy to have come this year because there are many of these that are blighting people's lives. Many of these ways of thinking that are blighting people's lives. And there are many things that are being done as welfare, well meant, but which is not helping people get out of that need of dependence until they can get out of it. So we need to be able to talk about people like people. So for instance, certain words are not, we had a Lepers Act. And we had a person who works among persons with leprosy who came and said, there are no lepers. I don't call you tuberculosis. Why are you calling me a leper? Eh? There are persons with leprosy. It's the same thing with there are no criminals. There are people who commit crime. And if we forget the person, if we forget the people, then we are going to find that we are actually complicit in perpetuating various forms of of disability, social disability in a sense, from which it's difficult for people to emerge.
Thank you very much. Would you like to take some?
I'm fine with it, sure.
Yeah. Right, we'll take yeah, go ahead. Ask your question.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the enlightening session. Enlightening session. So, I was. Actually, I'm working on a story on slum rehabilitation in Delhi, and I found out that they're saying in DUSIP, that is the Delhi Urban Shelter Improvement Board, they're saying that we don't need funding anymore because we've built enough houses for them. So all those demolition drives for G20, there is, I just asked a simple question, then what about the people who were not eligible under your scheme? And they don't have an answer for that. They like talk to this person, talk to that. So thank you so much for giving me all this background, but I just wanted to know what are your views on that?
Okay, I think there was someone right at the back who had their hand up.
Another question? Would you like to take a few?
Yeah, we'll take a few together.
Ma'am, you spoke of wandering lunatics and how they were put away. To my ears, putting them in a safe custody sounds better than leaving them astray. Not because they are a threat to society, but more so because non-lunatics could be a threat to them because of their vulnerability. And of course, as you gave the example of that lady who lived in a house, was indicted with lunacy and put away. I feel like the problem lies in the way the law is being implemented and not with the bare law itself. I would like to hear your opinion on that.
Okay, we'll take one more question.
Thank you, Dr. Ramanathan. The legislations that you discussed, the Land Acquisition and the Prevention of Beggary Act, these seem to be a little old now. The new form of subjugation of rights has to be something else. I like to believe that it is a very digital and IT-driven process which is happening. I would love to hear what you think about that.
So let's just take these three first before. Yeah. So on the, I think you heard her say that those who are not eligible, what happens to them? Eligibility is another such term. Poverty is the eligibility. There shouldn't be any other factor for saying who's eligible, because there is a strange thing that's happened in this country in the past 30 years. Suddenly we need documents for everything. We've not been a documentary country for years and years. If I go to a city and I find I have nowhere else to stay and I stay in a slum, the first thing I get is not a document. But how is eligibility determined? I should have been there before another term that gets used all the time, a cut-off date. So I should have been there first before 1995, or it may move to 2005, or it may move to 2014. That is, there should be a certain period of time that period of time will create an entitlement. And it's actually fascinating to see how very often you'll have, like there is one decision of the Supreme Court which came in the 1990s where they said, you shouldn't allow people to stay on the pavement or in slums for too long, because if they stay there, then they acquire certain kinds of entitlements. So keep demolishing them at regular intervals so that they don't have the rights. And this is it's what we call creation of the urban nomad, that you should never be able to settle in one place, except nomads might do it because out of volition. Here you are constantly being pushed around. And it's in that context that, it's not only in that context, but it's a context where this also applies, where in studying poverty through the law, we've looked at it as, first we said poverty, and then we realized that poverty is like treating it like a status. It's like people are poor, people are in poverty, it's like a status. Then I think social scientists have a term of immiseration, and we use impoverishment. And we use impoverishment because very often the law is itself responsible for people getting impoverished. So it's a process, but it's a process that is assisted by the law to impoverish people. So the Land Acquisition Act was that for the longest period of time. Then when we went to the tribal areas and saw what is happening there, every time you fence off a forest area, you're inducing vulnerability. People survive through various vicissitudes because they have access to various resources. If I can move around an area, I might be able to survive. I learn how to survive. But if you block me off, the fencing of the forest, about which much has been written, and E.P. Thompson has one of the brilliant books on this. Here you find that here too, so when the Forest Conservation Act comes in, the forest departments gets active in saying that we will give, I'll just step back a bit and tell you this, that the Forest Conservation Act came in 2006, and the two very important things it said, and again it's a question of language, it said, we are setting right a historic injustice. What was the historic injustice they were setting right? That from before 1927, but certainly from 1927, which is a law that still exists, which is the Indian Forest Act, the law made everybody illegal who was staying in the forest. There was nothing illegal about their stay. So what is illegal? It is done by the law. So it rendered people illegal and then kept them in that precarity for the longest period of time. You could be there at the state's sufferance, and they would be regularly challaned just to make the statement that you are illegal where you are. So they say that historic injustice we are setting right, and we are recognizing your rights, not settling rights on you, not giving you rights. We are recognizing the rights that you've always had. But then in the implementation, you say, tell me your individual rights. How much land did you cultivate? And then you fence the rest off. The state fences the rest off, which means that access to all those resources, which was part of the community and habitat rights, gets shrunk. There is an effort in the law to try and recognize community forest rights, to recognize habitat rights, but there's a great reluctance in actually recognizing it. So you find that these are all the contexts. So when we talk about urban spaces and we talk about cutoffs, cutoff date, in the Forest Conservation Act, they said, 75 years, if you can show that you've been here. How do I show that I've been here for 75 years? So, and we don't accept oral evidence, it all has to be documentary evidence now. So the idea of eligibility, therefore, cannot be by putting the burden on people who are already bearing the burden of not being legal. It has to be something else. So I think we need to, the one thing I haven't at least found much writing on is the idea of the documentary citizen. We've had this to a certain extent being spoken about in Assam when the NRC has been on, but not very much in other places. On on the idea of the wandering lunatic, actually it wasn't like they said there should be no place of safe custody. What they were saying was that prison cannot be a place of safe custody where you just block people off. Then in some cases, because they require treatment, it might be a hospital, which is a place of safe custody. But the idea that custody means putting people behind walls and forgetting about them, that got broken down in the early 80s, but it seems to have resurfaced. So we really need, these don't disappear at one shot. We have to keep at them to make sure that that idea of walls as blocking off a public from people who you see as aberrations, that distinction, that kind of breaking down, that's what I was talking about. Yeah, and on old laws and IT, actually you've got me on a. I'm afraid I have very elaborate views on looking at people through IT, asking people to live through IT. I share many of the views of many people who are writing, fortunately, especially after generative AI has come in. And I think we all know about the digital divide, and we know that I think by now we also know that the idea of technology being brought in among people has created one more hierarchy that people have to go through, and that people who are who are unable to, where legality is being defined and then being imposed on a people, and you use technology and you use terms like, actually one of the most fascinating terms that I think has emerged in recent times is the idea of the presenceless. I don't need to see you. I don't need to know where you are. I don't need to know who you are. I just need to know what I need to know. And so please be absent. Actually, in my head at least, it's one of the things that tells us how unimportant, how redundant, how dispensable actual people have become to those who control technologies. So it'll require a few days maybe to go through this.
Good afternoon. My question is regarding, do we look at poverty from the lens of identity as well? Because there have been instances where the state has pushed people to poverty. In terms of demolitions, slum demolitions, we see that identity has played a role. In other terms, I would also like to state, say for example, in my state, Jammu and Kashmir, we generally look at poverty as an external thing. We see people as people from mainly Hindi heartland, Bihar, Jharkhand, Odisha, Bengal, coming to Jammu and Kashmir, and we treat poverty as an external thing. So is the academia looking at it from the perspective of identity and what that means for poverty?
Good afternoon, ma'am. Thank you for the session, firstly. Ma'am, my question is, what happens in our system is that we vote and the government is formed, and then they have the power to bring in laws, and we as citizens cannot override the laws that the government bring in. But then you say that when there is poverty, we do not bring in judiciary or police. So who do we bring in? And also, how do we ensure the creation of entitlement that you've been talking?
It's like 15 questions in 3 sentences. Pretty clever.
Actually.
Okay. So just a word on identity first. See, this idea of identity is much too complex. What they've tried to do through this UID kind of thing is to, it's a very reductionist idea of identity. One of the things that, this is the 75th year of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and one of the things that is recognized across human rights documents is the right to identity of any person. And the identity is not something that can be imposed on a person. Identity is something that you discover for yourself. And we all know that we have multiple identities. I mean, we are not just one thing or another. I certainly am not my thumbprint. So that's, that much is clear. But there is one aspect which I'm just going to get into because you've given me an opening. We found that one reason that the system, definitely the judicial system, but generally the system seems to find roots out, like talking about eligibility, talking about cutoff, talking about the law. One of the reasons, and I can kind of understand that, is overwhelm. The problem is so huge that it feels like we can't deal with it, and therefore we kind of leave it. We try and reduce the problem as much as we can. So if I have to rehabilitate 10% of the people who are being displaced, I might still manage to do it. If I have to do it for 100, I may not be able to do it at all. In 2002, there was a judgment of the Delhi High Court where the judge said in the decision, it's not a decision that I would recommend to anybody, but one of the things that he says, which I can understand where he comes from, he said, at the rate at which we are resettling people today, and at the number at which we have slums today and dwellers in slums, it would take 272 years for us to complete the process. So it's a sense of overwhelm. But the tragedy was his, what he did with that. He said, therefore, there should be no resettlement. And therefore, demolish, let people figure out what they want to do. So that's one issue. So when you were saying that in Jammu and Kashmir, listen, if there is no poverty among people of that kind, of that nature, among people who belong to Jammu and Kashmir, please keep it that way, because getting out of poverty is very difficult. But the idea of the other, and therefore the problem being that of the other, I don't think that's confined to Jammu and Kashmir alone. The idea of the other, and I work a lot in Delhi, and in Delhi, for instance, when people would be brought, in the beggars' court, in fact, where they would be brought, even in Tihar, they had one system where the court, there's a huge backlog in courts, and so the conviction rate is low. So to meet these two problems, the court had set up, the High Court first and then endorsed by the Supreme Court, they had set up a system where, and many states have this, where a magistrate will go to the court and have what is called, to the prison and have what is called a camp court. So they'll have a court in the campus, and people who've committed petty crime, who are not committed, people who are said to have committed, they've been brought in saying that they committed petty crime, will be brought before that magistrate, and if they confess to the crime, then they will be let off by that evening or very soon after. So there's an inducement, and they will be brought before that magistrate only if they've spent at least 2 months in prison. So you can imagine who will be brought in these cases, because who is going to be in prison for 2 months being charged with some petty crime? It's not going to be someone who can manage to get out otherwise. So by then their defenses are down, and then if they confess, it means that the backlog is reduced. It also means that a conviction has been, has been registered. In many of these cases, they would say, if they found wandering, if they, they either get picked up under the Beggars Act or they get picked up under the IPC or CRPC. They are inside. They are asked, so which state are you from? And then if you say UP or Orissa or whatever, they'll say, I'll be giving you a ticket for you to go back. If you're found wandering here again, you already have a conviction against you. Remember that. Because if you go back after a first conviction, then it's like a repeat offender, which is like very serious. And these are petty offenses. So the othering and thinking that the problem belongs somewhere else and I shouldn't have to deal with it is a very common phenomenon that we find across states. I think that, so we may need to recognize that this normalizing shouldn't happen anywhere. The idea of the other in these things, we do need to care, never mind where they come from. And you want to follow that up?
I also had a second-fold question to that.
You did?
See, this is the perception of people themselves, how they perceive poverty as the other. And the second one is, when the state itself chooses to push you to poverty, looking at your identity. So one is of the people's perception, as you have just addressed, but do we look at poverty like that? Because we look at poverty as an identity itself, that they're just poor. But we do not look at them basically, which the state sometimes does. It looks at them as something, a minority, and then pushes it to poverty in terms of demolition, in terms of taking away their lands, criminalizing them, say the example of Uttar Pradesh, where a certain community is criminalized and then pushed to poverty forcefully. So
actually,
what about that?
What you are describing now, which is the bulldozer phenomenon that we are witnessing now, I think that bulldozer phenomenon is fundamentally illegal. It's only the power of the state that is allowing them to do it. So there is nothing that I can tell you in the law which will cover this, because it's completely outside the law and it's completely only about power. But where this becomes, and so we need a different approach for that. I think anyone who's willing to see it can see that this is just the power of the state being abused. But where we may find a slightly different, slightly more nuanced thing is where we are talking about illegal migrants. And then, so we already start with the idea of the illegal in migration. And that, I think, is creating a huge host of problems. And one of the things when the UID case was going on, I think one petitioner there were some 27 petitioners. And one petitioner, who had filed the case early, was talking about the illegal migrant. All the others were agreed that if you're going to apply a system like this in welfare, everybody is entitled to human rights. It doesn't matter if you're a legal citizen, not, whatever. Everyone should have that basic. Everyone should have that food. No one should have to die of starvation. But that perception which has been there among various people working with communities has not been part of state policy for much too long. At least for the past 10 years, it hasn't been part of state policy, that you see any person who is in the territory of this country as being your responsibility to see that they do not have to fall below a certain level of humanity. So that is a problem that we are faced with. So, but this is not just a question of language. In fact, it's very interesting that in the UP case, it is called bulldozer justice. And bulldozers have had the worst name in the universe. I think in Israel you had a young girl being, many years ago, going before the caterpillar, and it caused a huge outcry around the world. And the fact that these things are getting normalized is the problem. That we don't seem to have the language in which we can destroy the ideas that are being given to us. So we have to change that. And a quick one on, I'm going to make it a quick one because I think the questions answered themselves in part. But I'll answer the last part anyway. When I say no judiciary, no police, what do I mean? It means that when you bring in the judiciary, it's not about judiciary being bad or the police being bad. It's just that their role in destitution and poverty cannot be in custodialization. It can't be to say that, okay, what was the judiciary's role in the Beggars Act? The person who is brought in saying that they were found begging will be produced before the magistrate, who will then give them these options, because under the law the only option you give is that you give an undertaking, and then if in 1 month you have not found a job, then you're going to be in for a long period of time, because you've also broken your undertaking. Now that's going to be an additional problem that you have, and then they'll send them off to the hospital to be looked at and then sent to the institution. This role doesn't need to be performed where poverty is not a crime. That the role shouldn't exist. So too with the police. The police are supposed to deal with law and order. Poverty is not a law and order issue. But very often, people who are in conditions of, which is why ostensible poverty has become a big deal. If you look poor and you're found to be wandering, there is an attribution of dangerousness to you. And that's a problem. So we need to get these out. What do you put in its place? So when we actually talked to the person who was in charge of sending in legislations, they said we can't just have a repeal of the anti-beggary law because people will object. Give us something in its place. That's when these 4 were clearly given to them. And the alternative law was to say, if you look in almost anywhere, social justice among all the departments will come somewhere near the bottom. So we said when a person from social justice and empowerment is picking up somebody, they don't pick them up. They go to them, they give them options. You offer things to people who are in different conditions of poverty and destitution. If they feel it is good for them to take it, they will take it. But you have to be able to convince them. What we have so far is only a history of incarceration. That doesn't help anybody. So you have to get past all that suspicion. And that's the task of anyone who wants to convince somebody else. It can't be through power and coercion. So there is a legislation which gives certain, which creates certain entities who will be authorized under that law to reach out. But they can't take action against anybody. There's a big difference. So you don't give that authority. Authority over the lives of the poor cannot be an option at all in the law. That's what we're advocating.
Thank you very much, Dr. Usha Ramanathan. Just 1 sec. We have a vote of thanks.
Thank you. I think it's my pleasure to deliver the vote of thanks for this really excellent lecture. Thank you, Usha ma'am, Dr. Usha Ramanathan, for accepting our request and making it here today, given the circumstances. I think there is a lot for us to reflect upon as journalists from your lecture. I would also like to thank Mr. Dr. Narayanan, son of Dr. T.G. Narayanan, for his support in organizing this lecture. And of course, my thanks to Mr. Sashi Kumar, chairman of the Asian College of Journalism, for his support in organizing these important events. I would also like to most importantly thank the technical staff, the system admin, electrical team, and others for managing the event today. And most especially, my special thanks to the campus caretaker, security staff, admin team, hostel wardens, student volunteers, and other support staff for helping us return to a sense of normalcy by following the cyclone, by cleaning up the campus and making it accessible for all of us. And of course, my thanks to the students and the faculty and other guests who are here today. Thank you very much and have a good weekend.